Reading with your kids.
Hey, so great to see you. Come on in. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast, coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the wonderful city of Boston, Massachusetts. We have an incredibly powerful show for you today. That's why we want you to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you find your podcast. We don't want you to miss an episode. Our guest today is the author of the very powerful book, Leaving Kent State. Her name is Sabrina Fedel. We would be so very, very happy if you would visit readingwithyourkids.com/yummy. Readingwithyourkids.com/yummy. Go there and find out about the easiest way to snack smart and do good. We're talking about love with food. Love with Food helps you discover new, organic, all-natural, and gluten-free snacks delivered directly to your door every single month. And membership starts as low as $7.99 a month. And this is why we love Love with Food so much. Love with Food will donate a portion of the proceeds to help fight childhood hunger in the U.S. and all around the world. Love with Food donates to organizations like Feeding America and the Global Food Banking Network. So join us to help end childhood hunger one meal at a time. Visit readingwithyourkids.com/yummy to say goodbye to boring grocery store selections and to start snacking smart and doing good with Love with Food. Join us on the line right now from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, one of my favorite places. We're going to be talking today about a really difficult moment in our history and a real turning point in American history. Our guest is the author of Leaving Kent State. Please welcome to the show, Sabrina Fedel. Sabrina, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being on the show. As I was saying before we started, I have very strong memories of Kent State and what happened. I was young. I think I was a freshman in high school, but it really was a turning point in the country. Why don't you remind everybody about that day back in May in 1970?
Well, it started really on Friday when the kids learned that we had invaded Cambodia, and that was a big betrayal to them because President Nixon had been promising to withdraw from Vietnam, and everyone felt that once he invaded Cambodia, that was a lie. Mm-hmm. So some of the boys who had been there, a couple of graduate students in the history department actually burned their draft cards and held a little protest. And then that night there was some trouble in the bars and they closed the bars early and the kids had a little bit of a riot. And so that led up to the National Guard coming onto campus and into town. And that was really what led to Monday, which was the actual shootings where protesters met with the National Guard that was on campus, and it turned ugly.
It certainly did. As I recall, there were 5 students were killed.
4.
4 students were killed, and a number of others were seriously wounded.
I believe 9 were wounded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's hard for us to sit back right now and imagine the National Guard being sent to a college campus and actually opening fire on students.
Right. And even then, the students at Kent, I think some of them understood the danger, but there were a lot who didn't. There were a lot who thought that they were carrying rubber bullets, that they weren't actually in any danger. There were students at the protest who were just, unfortunately, right before it happened, class changed. And so there were students coming out of class and going to their next class who just stopped to watch what was going on. Mm-hmm. And there were students protesting, and there was just sort of, it was one of the first warm days they'd had in the spring. It had been a really, really brutal winter. And so everybody was kind of glad to be outside and glad for a beautiful day and, kind of surprised and didn't know what to do with the whole guard being on their campus. People were angry about it, but people were also kind of watching the spectacle of it. And so a lot of the people who were standing there, one of the students who was killed was in the ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps. So it was pretty random. Once they started firing, once the National Guard turned and started firing, it was very random who they hit. They did get two of the protesters. Well, actually, they killed two of the protesters, and they killed two innocent people who were just watching. And then they wounded at least one of the other protesters.
Now, is my memory serving me right? Is that where that iconic photo comes from, where one of the students is putting a flower in the gun barrel of the guardsman?
Yes. That happened on Sunday. And that student was Alison Krauss, and she was killed the next day. And she was a protester. She did believe that we should get out of Vietnam. And the day before, she'd been on campus, and the guard was all around. And the night before that, on Saturday night, somebody had burned there was an ROTC building on campus, and they had burned it in protest. And it was just sort of like almost a Quonset hut, not quite a Quonset hut. It wasn't a real building exactly. And actually there had been plans for a long time to get rid of it and replace it. But they started the fire. And so then the next day the guard was on campus, and it was very much a carnival feel. And Allison apparently took a flower and put it into the barrel of one of the guardsmen's guns and said, "Flowers are better than bullets." And a senior officer to the boy that was holding the rifle came by, took the flower out, and was very upset with her. And of course, then the next day she was killed.
A horrible moment. I introduced the show by saying this really kind of was a turning point in American history. And we're definitely going to talk about Leaving Kent State, and because it is a YA novel. But can you just talk a little bit about how that incident changed history and changed the culture here in the United States?
Sure. So there had been, right before this happened, in the fall, people learned of the My Lai massacre. And that was really shocking to people, that American troops could go into a town and execute civilians. So there was a growing antagonism against the war. There were a lot of people, because there was a draft, a lot of the boys were really upset that the war was going on. They didn't want to serve, but unless you could get a deferment for college, if your number got called, your number got called. And so there was a lot of unrest, and people didn't really understand what was going on over there. There were some reports coming back that the troops there were very demoralized. So it was growing more and more, and President Nixon had been promising to get us out of Vietnam. And then, of course, when he invaded Cambodia, people really felt betrayed by that. So nobody really expected. There had been a lot of protests, and some of them had been violent, not in the way that this one was, but, kids getting arrested, kids getting beaten up, whatever, that sort of protesting thing. But they had mostly happened at Berkeley in California, and in Ohio, it was Ohio University where most of the protests were happening, and there had been a tear gas bomb set off on campus and things like that. Kent was kind of there were protesters, but they were pretty, it was a laid back college town that had a huge music influence to it, and a lot of the bars you could go to and hear live music on the weekends, and very kind of diverse little town. And so nobody expected it to happen there. And I think it was primed to happen somewhere, probably, in some level of violence, but this was really unprecedented, and no one could quite fathom the idea of the National Guard actually shooting unarmed protesters. And so it was really shocking for people, although there were a lot of people who at first blamed the students and felt they heard reports that the students were armed, The students were not. They did apparently, some of them threw some bricks or stones, but there was no documented injuries to the National Guardsmen, and there certainly was no one with a weapon that was ever found to be one of the students. None of the students had any weapons at all.
So tell us about Leaving Kent State, and tell us the story and some of the characters that we'll meet, and then we'll talk a little bit about why you chose to write the book.
Okay. So Leaving Kent State is a story about a girl named Rachel. She's 17 years old, and she's a senior in high school, and she wants very much to go to Pratt Institute to be an artist. And her father's an English teacher at Kent State, and he wants her very much to stay at Kent and go to the university, go to Kent State University. And she keeps thinking that she wants to have a plan to get her dad to let her go. And she's been waiting for her next door neighbor and crush to come home from Vietnam. And so it starts in October of 1969, the day that he comes home. And she's excited because she thinks he's going to be able to help her convince her dad to let her go to Pratt. And then he comes home injured, and because of his injuries, he's lost all of his own dreams to be a musician. And she realizes pretty quickly that she's going to be on her own to figure out how to get out of Kent State. And so she and this boy, Evan, they have a pretty close friendship anyway, and she tries to figure out how to help him while also trying to convince her dad to let her go. So it's that story, and it follows what was going on in Kent, and it kind of shows how Kent became a microcosm of what was going on all over the country. There was just this increasing pressure of protesting and people upset with the war, and there was a lot of chaos going on in our society anyway. The postal workers went on strike. There were domestic terrorism events against companies like IBM in New York. And so there was a lot of social unrest going on, a lot of racial tension. So not completely unlike our environment today, but that's the journey of the book. So she is working towards getting her dad, trying to convince her dad, and she decides that the way to convince her dad is to make a bet with him that if she can wow him with her senior art project at school, that he will let her go to Pratt. And so she decides to skip school to go to the protests on Monday to try to get photographs to work on her senior art project to convince her dad to let her go to Pratt. And that's how she gets caught up in the shootings.
Wow. Incredibly powerful. What was it that inspired you to take this story and place it in that time, in that moment in history?
I saw something about Kent State on television one day as I was ironing, and it just really struck me that it was a young people's story. The victims were all young people, and it impacted our country so deeply for young people. And young people trying to have a voice, young people trying to say, we want to be able to vote. We want to be able to have a say in whether you send us to war or not. We want to have a say in whether you draft us. And so it really struck me as a young person's story. And so I thought, I'd like to do something with that. And then I was sure that there must be something on it. And when I went to do the research, I found out there weren't any other stories about it. And so that really surprised me. So I started to make a lot of trips to Kent to find out about what had really happened.
What's the atmosphere like there now? Is the memory still fresh in a lot of people's minds?
Yeah, in fact, every May 4th, they have a commemoration, a memorial ceremony, and they recognize what happened, and a lot of the people who were there still come to it. People who were hurt, Thomas Grace comes usually, Alan Canfora, some of the professors who were there at the time, Jerry Lewis, they come every year, and they put on a program to memorialize it, and they have the places where in the parking lot behind Taylor Hall where three of the the victims were killed, they have those parking spaces roped off, or not roped off, but there's stanchions at each corner to commemorate where they were killed. And so it's always with the campus. They're very aware of it. They try to, I think, respect it and understand and grow from where they were at that time. And it's definitely a part of their culture now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you see any parallels to what happened at Kent State and what's going on today?
I do. I've been told by people who lived through that. I don't have a memory of it. I was only little when it happened. But I've been told by other people that they don't see so many parallels, but I see a lot. I see the idea of racial tension so strong. And in the Vietnam War, a lot of there was a Black United Students group on campus, but they didn't join the protests because they felt that even when they were aligned against the war with white students, that they were more discriminated against, that their voices weren't heard properly. And so, there was always that kind of tension running through the campus. There was a lot of tension about education and how to afford education, which I, as a teacher at college today, I see all the time. And we certainly hear about it in our news today. There was the idea of how much should we trust our government, and when should we be challenging them, and when should we be thinking about that? And I see a lot of that right now with the protests we've had in the last couple of years here. So I do think there are a lot of parallels. I think we're still learning how to protest and what to protest, mm-hmm. and how to find a collective voice. So I see a lot of parallels.
Yeah. One of the questions that we always ask guests is, what kind of conversations can a parent and child, uncle, aunt and child, and we're not talking about children reading this book, but what kind of conversations can families have when their young adults experience this book and they co-read it together and sit down and talk about it?
That's a great question. And I do, on my website, I do have discussion questions for classes or parents if they would like to do that. I highly recommend them talking about this book with their kids. I think there's a lot to consider that's still relevant today. So the kinds of questions that I hope people will look at are questions about, where is our voice? What should we protest? What are we willing to risk our lives for? How much government oversight should there be to how we protest? And I think finding art and finding art and empathy for other people and being able to say, this isn't okay, and what happened here today isn't okay, and we need to do something about that. I think that was the big lesson. Kent State really changed things for this country, because when people finally realized the injustice of what had happened that day, it really solidified the anti-war movement in this country. It was the beginning of the real end for the Vietnam War. It was really where people's tolerance began to shift of what they were willing to put up with. And I think it's so hard to, even today, it's so hard to care about what goes on in the world sometimes because it feels so far away and we're so busy and we feel so overwhelmed sometimes. But these kids, for them, it was very much a real thing. They could get drafted. They could lose their deferments. They had to keep certain grades, or if they didn't keep their grades up in their major, they could lose their deferment. So they had a thing called the dating game, the major dating game, deferral dating game. Sometimes they called it, where if they were slipping in a major, they would change their major to make sure they kept their grades up. I mean, for these kids that were going through this, it was a real threat, and there was a lot of misunderstanding between generations of what we were fighting for and whether It reminds me of the Colin Kaepernick situation of generations not really understanding what one's saying versus what the other is saying. So I think there's a lot of room to think about how we frame protest and how we frame problems even in our society.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a really good point, because I think I hear people arguing today about everything. You know, there's and what I don't experience are people actually listening to each other. I hear
Right.
a lot of passion, a lot of anger, a lot of very loud voices expressing their opinion, but they're not being heard by people on the other side because they're not listening. They're just waiting for a moment where they can jump in and shout their opinions. And that's not productive at all.
Right, I agree. And I think that, that was one of the problems, is that the kids were really fed up with not feeling heard. And they had gotten very vocal. They would swear at their protests. They had chants that had swear words in it, and that was very shocking to the establishment. And they didn't. Vice President Agnew, particularly at that time, was just vitriolic in how he labeled students, how he would use slang terms for them, calling them brown shirts and saying that they were all communists and that they were, throwing labels on them to try to dehumanize their arguments, and invalidate their arguments. And yet they had a lot of valid arguments. And that's not to say that everything that they did in their protests was correct. Certainly vandalizing property wasn't okay. But they were young people who were really trying to figure out how to be heard. And they really felt that they weren't heard. And so it's certainly something when we look at activists like the Parkland students, that to think about, well, how are they doing it in a better way, and what are the right ways to protest?
Mm-hmm. And I think too, and this is, I apologize if this is going to sound silly, and I don't mean it to, but even within our own families, a lot of times, a lot of the conflict that happens between parent and child happens because the child and also the parent, they're not speaking to each other. They're just taking turns speaking. I've mentioned on the show in the past that a real huge turning point for my son when he was really struggling in middle school just came when I just said to him, look, tomorrow night, you're going to have a chance to tell me every single thing that you're upset about. And I'm going to sit and I'm going to listen. And I'll stay up as late as you need to. And we'll work through all of them. And then we're going to solve those and put those to bed. And when we solve them and we put them to bed, then there's no need to bring them up again. And we did that. And it was incredible in terms of the peace that it brought to our family, because it was no, you can't bring up when you were 5 years old and you didn't get ice cream because you brought it up and we dealt with it. And
Right.
And I think we can't change, as a parent, as a kid, we can't expect to change the culture by ourselves, but we can change the culture in our families by listening to each other. And then we can bring that out into the world, and we can start working together and changing the culture and the society at large, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really important. There were a lot of parents. I met a woman who had been one of the protesters, and she said when she went home, she said her dad was railing against the students and said there were people who, after the students were killed, said they should have shot them all. And her father was one of them. And she said, you realize that would have included me. And he said, well, if you were there, you were wrong. So be it. Mm-hmm. And that was so hurtful to her. And I'm sure, I can't imagine that her father truly believed that, or would have wanted to lose her. But because he was angry, he was able to say something that was just so off the wall. And I always just think that it's there was so much tension during the Vietnam War of parents and children not understanding each other and not understanding how each other felt. And there was a lot of, well, if you don't support the war, you don't support the president, and you don't support my views, and they couldn't understand that their kids could see something another way, and that maybe in the end the kids were actually right. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important that we listen to young people and we give them that validation to hear them. And that doesn't mean that all of their ideas are good ideas or that we should support all of their ideas, but we certainly need to be able to hear them in a way that is legitimate to them, and that honestly steps back and says, well, am I thinking about this on a bias, or does this child have a true complaint and a true problem to solve? Mm-hmm. And I think when we stop and we let go of anger and we actually think about that stuff, we can really make progress in how we deal with each other.
Yeah. That was, that is one of the things that I do clearly remember about that time, is that people were looking at the same information. They were looking at the same circumstances from completely different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And they weren't able to put themselves in the other line of sight to see from that different perspective. And what a difference it would have made if we were able to have done that.
Absolutely. I spoke with one woman who had, she had been instrumental in getting the historical society there to preserve records, and she also had, with other people, had started an oral history project that actually anyone can go online and listen to, and it's oral histories of people who were there that day, whether they were on campus or just in town, and their memories of what happened that day. And she and her husband had just come to Kent State the year before. It was their first year teaching at Kent State. Both of them were teachers. And I said to her, I feel as I do this research that people left this event with the same lens that they came into it. So if they were very conservative and they thought the students were wrong, that didn't really change. They might have decided that students shouldn't have been shot at, but they still blamed the students. They still felt that they were the biggest problem in the whole situation, whereas people who came in with a lens of this was just, so unimaginable, how could you do this? They also couldn't understand the Guard, how the Guard could have done it, what could have started them to turn around and start shooting. And we still don't really know. There's still debate about what actually caused them. The protests were going on. They had marched down the field and had actually gotten trapped between a fence and the crowd, and turned around and came back up the hill. And then, people thought it was over. They thought they were going to go and, just go to a different area of the campus and kind of hang out. And instead, when they got to the top of the hill, they turned and they started firing. And there's a lot of debate about what caused that. And there is no definitive answer that I was able to be sure of in my research. And so to see people come in with this lens and not be able to shift, or not be able to say, oh wow, maybe this isn't quite what I thought. Or just to be able to see, okay, well, maybe they did have some genuine fear, or they had just come off of a trucker strike where they had been shot at, the National Guardsmen. So they were very, on edge themselves, mm-hmm. right? And they were in all that gear. It was a hot day. They had their gas masks on, and they hadn't been able to control the crowd with tear gas because it was too windy. So there was a lot going on that could lead to what happened, because people weren't able to step back and think about what could this be like for somebody on the other side. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How did writing Leaving Kent State change you?
That's a great question. I think it's made me more aware that even though I feel that the shootings were terribly wrong, I am more understanding of how things could have gotten to that point that something so terrible did happen. And so I think it's made me more aware to stop and think about, well, what's the big picture here? What's going on with the different sides that leads to conflict? How do we think about conflict in a way that prevents getting to that tender moment where something could happen very easily? So it's made me more careful about that, I think, in my thinking.
Well, it's certainly, it's important to look back at this moment in history, but I think, what you just articulated there is something that we as a nation, probably as a world, need to do today. Because I think if we take the time to step back and look and try to figure out what, this avalanche of information that we're getting from all different sides, which is accurate, which isn't accurate, take the time to look at different perspectives and take the time to start listening to each other. That's the only way we're going to be able to move forward and to really kind of build that world of peace that the protesters were hoping for, and probably that the guardsmen were hoping for too.
Right, I think that's true.
Yeah. Well, tell everybody where they can find out more, not only about Leaving Kent State, but also about Sabrina Fedel.
So anybody who's interested can find me on the web at www.sabrinafedel.com is my website. And you can find my books really anywhere on Amazon. You can request them at your local bookseller, from IndieBound, from Barnes & Noble, if they're available wherever books are sold.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that Fedel, in Sabrina's case, is spelled Fedel, because I spelt it the other way and was getting all these books about Cuba, and I'm like, no, that didn't happen in Cuba. So this has been a really important conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to write Leaving Kent State, because I think I think it would be a really important experience for families to read together and to talk about, and I think it can really kind of help us change the way we're acting right now, and hopefully change the way we're acting and interacting with each other for the better.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I put a lot of work into it, and so I'm thrilled that people appreciate it.
Yeah. We've been talking today to the author of Leaving Kent State, Sabrina Fedel. Sabrina, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Helena Bailey. She'll be here to talk to us about empowering kids and also tell us about her brand new picture book, Black Princess. Hey, if you are the author of a great children's book, we would love to have you as a guest on the show. And as you can see, we feature authors from every genre of children's literature. Picture books, middle grade books, chapter books, YA books, very powerful books like Leaving Kent State. And if you are the author, we would love to give you a chance to tell the world about your great book. Really, and that really is true. When you're on the show, you are talking to people all over the world. And being a guest on the show is fun, it's easy, and it doesn't cost you a thing. All you need to do is to go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, click on the contact button, let us know about your great book. We'll let you know the next easy steps. Hey, we want to thank Sabrina Fedel for helping us relive that very powerful moment back in May of 1970 and sharing her book, Leaving Kent State. Also want to thank my producer, Fatima Khan, for everything she does for the podcast. I want to thank my amazing, beautiful wife for all the love that she brings to my life. And of course, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to subscribe to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to let your friends know about the show. But most of all, thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking through the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.